legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Jasun Horsley, who joins us to discuss transhumanism and the colonisation of space. The talk draws upon Jason's book Prisoner of Infinity, UFOs, Social Engineering and the Psychology of Fragmentation. Despite the idealism and hope surrounding the first manned space flights and missions to the moon, in their wake the drive to explore and colonise space seemed to stall, or even regress. Dreams of cities on Mars and beyond appeared to be just that, dreams. Today, however, the space race is on again like never before, with Elon Musk's SpaceX, Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin, and Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic just three of the high-profile companies leading the charge. But what lies behind this flurry of activity? Are the forces driving technological development changing? Then we have the technologies of transhumanism, such as artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, biotechnology, cybernetics, cloning, mind-machine melding, mind uploading, and so on. The nexus between these and the new space race is highly significant and not a little sinister. Transcend the body, escape the earth, achieve immortality among the stars, and all those nasty political, economic and social problems simply dissolve. But walking away won't be so easy, especially when our predicament has its origin in the way we think about ourselves, each other, and our place in the world. This entire agenda is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of life, death, and consciousness, a new understanding of which is urgently needed if our species is to survive. Hello and welcome, Jason, and thank you so much for joining us once again on legalizefreedom.com.
Thanks, Greg, for having me back one more time. It's been quite a few runs we've done now.
It is. Well, I hope it's not the last. The title of our talk today is Transhumanism and the Colonisation of Space. Now, this was partly inspired, or largely inspired, by reading your book, Prisoner of Infinity, UFOs, Social Engineering and the Psychology of Fragmentation. We've talked about that in a couple of previous interviews. If listeners are interested in any of that, they can find links to those other talks on the website page for this talk. That's at legalize-freedom.com. Before we jump into our topic, though, if anybody's coming to this cold for the first time, just say a little bit about yourself and your work.
Right, well, that's always hard. My mind went to my thrift store right away, which is the last thing probably your listeners want to hear about. That's what I think of as work, I suppose. I run a thrift store, a little business in Canada. I've written a whole bunch of books, and the books have become, they've been evolving and transmuting over the years. Prisoner of Infinity, I think, is the most complete work. It represents most closely what I've been endeavoring to do throughout the years, really, but more and more consciously, and what I've recently termed it as mapping hell. So actually my latest book is called Maps of Hell. It's about Hollywood. But the previous books, Prisoner of Infinity, Seen and Not Seen, and Vice of Kings, were very much installments in this process of mapping hell, which is a poetic language, of course, for, I would say, tracing the contours of trauma within my own body as a way to hopefully dissolve it, to release the sort of tensions and the toxins within the body that have turned my own body into a living hell. So that's my summation. I wanted to make it relevant to today's topic as well, because I think transhumanism is very symptomatic of that traumatic response to toxins in the body by projecting outward into some fantasy realm. And I've definitely been susceptible to that in my own life, even if I never bought into transhumanism for a second. I bought into my own crucial fictions, as you know, and so that's very much what I've been mapping over the years, is these crucial fictions of the mind as a way to try and relocate my body in space-time.
Now, if listeners don't know what transhumanism is, they're just going to have to do a little bit of homework to get up to speed. The Wikipedia entry on it is perfectly satisfactory. I feel, and this was, reinforced by reading your book, that the whole transhumanism manifesto, the whole agenda, is based in a fundamental misunderstanding of life and death. Now, that in itself might be a little bit beyond the scope of Prisoner of Infinity, I don't know. But anyway, the entire agenda seems misplaced to me. And not least because, if we bring it down to, more worldly realms, this idea of transcending, escaping the body, escaping problems, whether they're personal or societal or global, is a flawed response. Let's put it to say the least. And in your book, you talk about Ray Kurzweil, of course, one of the main cheerleaders of transhumanism, and also your work deals heavily with the work of Whitley Strieber, the Communion author, famous, the UFO guy, the guy who kind of reorientated the whole of ufology and alien lore with his work. You describe Kurzweil as suffering from, quote, the same psychic schism as Strieber. So from the point of view of what you've done so far and your feelings on the topic, maybe you could just add to what I've said.
I don't think that you were wrong there when how you began there with a fundamental delusion that transhumanism is symptomatic of and evidence of. So that's how I attempt to look at transhumanism in Prisoner of Infinity, and how I attempt to look at Strieber's work as symptomatic of a collective pathology. And that involves specifics as well. Of course, if one is trying to diagnose something, one doesn't just name it. One has to actually map the symptoms and trace the symptoms back to possible causes. And with trauma, one is intuiting causes, both deducing and intuiting, because the nature of trauma is that when it's profound, is that it creates amnesia. We forget it. Or we never really mentalize it or narrativize it because it's in the body. And so I'm making the correlation there between traumatic impact on the body and the creation of delusions, dissociative delusions. So that's how I look at Kurzweil. And of course with Kurzweil I look at the specifics of his particular fixations, as with Strieber. Strieber seems more fixated on the mother, Kurzweil more on the father, though of course it's not either or, it's usually both and and, but I do use some basic Freudian psychology in there, and Lacanian and Jungian and so on, just as lenses to try and understand the ways in which we confabulate pseudo solutions to problems that are too unbearable for us to actually face, such as trauma that's in the body. And so I think the key here to me is a refusal to allow our consciousness to be in the body, an unwillingness to allow our consciousness be in the body because there's something unbearable in our bodies. And the creation of narratives that not only allow us to escape our body by, going off into these fantasies, but the fantasies themselves. And I'm not saying fantasy, and this could be fantasy with a PH, the Freudian sense. These fantasies may indeed correspond with aspects of reality. They don't have to just be entirely, mind-based confabulations. But anyway, they're definitely uncoupled from reality in certain key aspects. The fantasies themselves are about leaving the body. So Strebers is about out-of-body experiences a lot, going off with these other interdimensional visitors and so on, non-human beings, non-physical beings, and of course Kurzweil's and the other transhumanists. The whole movement is about leaving the body behind.
Even though you've had space in the past, you've had space exploration and colonization enthusiasts such as the late Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk warning about what they saw as potential dangers of, well, specifically AI, but rolling that into the transhumanist thing as well. Despite that, we can still say that some of the same displacement applies to space exploration and colonization schemes, which is, if not transcend the body, then sort of escape the Earth, achieve immortality among the stars, and all those aforementioned problems I was talking about, they just somehow go away. Not quite sure how. So for me, in terms of like the Venn diagram overlap, there's a lot of common ground between these two subject areas.
Indeed, yes.
So this is sold to us in a way, these intimately interlinked agendas sold to us via propaganda that all of this is somehow necessary. In the case of space exploration, colonization got tremendous pressure on our systems here on Earth. Basically, the Earth isn't big enough for us, and the biosphere is collapsing, so we're going to have to go somewhere else. There's just no alternative. We'll have to just figure it out. It seems improbable, almost impossible at the minute, but we're going to have to do it. And in terms of the transhumanist agenda, that's inevitable. That it may only be 0.whatever% cheerleading are involved in this, but it's happening. Whether we like it or not, that's the way things are going. Techno-utopia. And it's almost like casting a spell on us. I mean, we've always had minority control in society. Societies, are inherently hierarchical. But it seems like the current situation is the smallest number of people ever with the most control.
Yes. Well, there were a lot of some assumptions in what you said there. And it's bringing to mind something I felt. I was reading a piece before we started speaking, and I also found there's some assumptions in that. And it occurred to me something I wanted to say at some point when we talked today, which is that there's this whole thing of mission creep. There's also Chinese whispers. When your trajectory is slightly off, if you maintain that trajectory without correcting it, then eventually you end up very, very far off. So with Chinese whispers, if they go on for long enough, you end up with receiving a message, down this line of miscommunication that has absolutely nothing to do with the original meaning, and then you pass it on just because you're on some sort of blind faith, that blind trust that you're receiving it from a good source where you're not. So the thing with transhumanism, in my view, and space colonization is that it's a symptom of insanity, essentially. And so if we take it too seriously, then we risk, like talking to a drunken schizophrenic in a bar, after a certain time, just to get along and maintain the conversation, we risk getting sucked into his own dementia. And so that's my feeling about transhumanism, why Prisoner of Infinity really was a labor of love and a kind of Herculean task to take on that degree of delusional belief that, as you say, is so widespread. And it does seem to be top down, but it's also become bottom up, because as I cover in Prisoner of Infinity, there's been a concerted effort over the decades to colonize our consciousness, to infiltrate our psyches with narratives about the wonders of space and colonization of space, Star Trek, from Star Trek onward. And now there are similar versions around transhumanism and technology and all the rest of it, although there's also dystopian visions, of course. So, you said, for example, that we have to get off the planet if we're going to survive. Well, I think we need to question that.
Oh, I don't agree. I don't agree with that, Jason, at all. I was just presenting the point of view that is presented to us.
Yeah.
Not least, by someone like Stephen Hawking. He said it multiple times. So, no, I don't believe that. I don't think we can. But sorry to cut across you.
No, that's okay. I wasn't sure how much you were just being a mouthpiece for these fictions and how, because they are so deeply embedded. So yeah, our situation on the planet, there certainly is a general belief that there's overpopulation and that the system can't support us, and that seems to be a delivery device for some of these proposed solutions. That itself makes me skeptical about the diagnosis, if you see what I mean. Are we overpopulated? Does that, what is it that makes the planet overpopulated? It's, as I write in Prisoner of Infinity, it's not that there's too many humans necessarily, it's that the system that's sustaining humanity is creating too much pressure for the ecosystem. It's and so the technology that is being proposed to solve these problems is only increasing them. And I see transhumanism as interesting in this way, because it seems that it's really exposing the mechanism of a delusion whereby the solution is so obviously, and I would say space colonization too, although that's a little harder to argue, the solution really is much worse than the problem. I mean, the solution of transhumanism essentially is saying destroy us. We should just destroy ourselves, and let technology take over. That's how I see it. And I know they have reasoning that supposedly we're not supposed to see it that way, but I just don't believe it. I think it's absurd, and that one would have to already be so uncoupled from organic existence and nature in the first place to even begin to believe it in the first place. With space colonization, it's not quite so obvious, but one of the things I addressed that is obvious is, why do we think that it would be in any way better, I mean, to float in a tin can, to quote David Bowie, like at best a floating shopping mall for several decades, or be frozen or whatever, or if it's Mars, to basically, I mean, if anyone's renovated a house, they know that it's a pretty hard life, imagine renovating a planet. My God, in what way is this supposed to be somehow easier than the situation we have on Earth? I mean, the only reason it's so hard on Earth is because we've been pursuing demented and delusional ideas and beliefs and philosophies as a way to try and solve problems. So then this is merely the continuation of that process, and of course we would take it with us. So it's really, I mean, bring it back to my original point, it's really hard to address something that, if it is a fundamental insanity, evidence or symptom of insanity, how do you address it? A therapist who talks to a person who's deep in delusion, they do have to enter the delusion, and they can't just say you're deluded. That's not going to work, right? So they do have to talk in the language of the delusion, but then the therapist risks actually enabling the delusion and becoming possessed by it. And that's what I feel. I feel that we're all on the edge now of getting sucked into this collective delusion, for various reasons. I mean, it's collective. For one, it's mimetic, it's spreading. We are in increasingly desperate times. Even if the solutions are making it worse, that doesn't change the fact that things are getting more and more desperate. And so we become less and less conscious, many of us. Like with the coronavirus, it seems as though there's something real happening, and then there's the way it's being, mediated or narrativized, and then there's the reaction, which is probably being manipulated. And a bunch of people going out and buying toilet paper and stocking up on toilet paper, or wearing surgical masks, these are not actual logical solutions. They're not realistic or sane behavior, particularly. They're not practical behavior, I mean. So, but when people are agitated, they will act in ways that are agitated, and that will increase the agitation collectively, and so it snowballs. So it's hard to talk about this directly, I guess I'm saying, because I think it's, and this is what you said right at the start, we're looking at something that is evidence of, I would say, to really get emphatic here, evidence of humanity collectively being on the point of insanity and therefore of self-destruction.
Well, I hope that it was evident from the tone of the magazine piece that I sent you that I was trying to do a couple of things. One was point out, everything's that I say that sounds like it's coming from them is presaged with, we are being told that, quote. And I was trying to highlight how ridiculous it was, but also how it is affecting people. So it's not so much about the realistic prospects for transhumanist schemes or space colonization plans or anything else, but it's how other people who are not perhaps very well up on it are responding to it and how they are buying into it. So it's not that I think these things are going to come to pass. It's just that our reaction to it, as you just mentioned with the virus, it's a similar type of dynamic at work there.
Yeah, and it is certainly people are buying into it incrementally. I mean, even insofar as how people become more and more dependent on their cell phones and more content to disappear into their cell phones rather than interact with their environment. That's a very real observable phenomena, and it's already extending into people taking microchips into their bodies in order to have more easy access at work and whatever other convenience, promises that the technology is giving. All of that is proceeding apparently according to plan, and much of this is Ray Kurzweil. He's a spokesperson for this agenda, and Kurzweil is threatening brain microchips in the brain that will link us to the artificial intelligence cloud by 2030, within 10 years. So if things continue as they have continued, then yes, we're looking at a terrifying, very near future. I don't think that they will. I think that we're so close to some sort of critical threshold that something's going to intervene. But I mean, that's fingers crossed behind my back. I don't know. I mean, hopefully I'll live to see this, and it could very well be that 10 years from now things are still grinding towards this hideous dystopia that is being packaged in such a way that people genuinely are looking at it as utopia, which I find absolutely mind-boggling. So, I mean, to use a specific example, I don't want to break into your thought there, but just to end on that, the Years, the BBC show with Emma Thompson, ended on a totally positive utopian version of transhumanism.
The book I was reading today, actually, and it's by the aforementioned next guest on the show. It's James Howard Kunstler, who writes a lot about economics and environment and what have you. I've had him on before. He has a little segment in his new book where he addresses transhumanism as part of this sort of techno-utopian, or what he calls techno-narcissistic dimension of society. And his interesting point is that he sees the transhumanist and sort of AI agenda as now in a sort of race with economic collapse, trying to get things done before it's no longer feasible for various reasons. And he says, I believe economic collapse is going to win the race.
Yeah. Well, I don't know what sort of collapse. It could even be psychological collapse, like human beings just start becoming so demented, so dissociated, so disconnected from reality, before the techno, the smart system, or whatever we're going to call it, is fully in place. And people aren't being run by algorithms quite yet, that they can't put finishing touches on it because people are running around so wildly that they won't take the implant.
Yeah, your mental state can get you through a lot of things. You look at people who've been imprisoned for decades, but yeah, your state of mind can get you through a lot of things. It can make the difference between survival and not in certain situations. And in that sense, in all sorts of contexts of problems that we're facing, I kind of worry about our collective state. Because it's a bit like, you can be the best driver in the world, but that won't stop some drunk guy or some old guy falling asleep, as happened to me once, crossing the median and crashing into. It doesn't, you're still the best driver out there, but you can't predict what other people are going to do, how they're going to react to things.
Well, that's true. And so then that brings up a kind of meta subject, which is, what can we turn to guide us, if not technology? If we know we can't trust our leaders, we know we can't trust social mandates or the laws or the governments, and we know more and more, I hope, some of us, you and I, perhaps, that we can't trust our technology. We certainly don't want to let algorithms or some, flawed human-created artificial intelligence regime guide us. So what can we turn to instead? And that would be, I would say, our bodies. Like, our bodies are guidance systems unto themselves. We know that bees can create mathematically complex hives without any knowledge of mathematics. They're following what we call instinct, but instinct is quite a lazy word, really. And also intuition, what's that? There's something guiding us if we let it. And that the technology is somehow imitating and replacing. And so people look for partners now, letting algorithms choose it. They do their shopping via algorithms. So our intuition and our instincts are being, we could say, co-opted, we could say counterfeited, whatever, but we're being sold, a technological and artificial surrogate for these things. And that indicates that, how valuable they are, essentially. So, and this is the larger subject that I said to you on Facebook. Colonization of space, what's that? Well, it's trying to get away from the Earth. Like, it's, that's even in the narrative. The Earth can't sustain us. We've got to go into space. Well, so there's a fear of the physical environment itself, that somehow it's going to kick back against us, or it's not going to support us, or whatever. But there's a lack of trust anyway in the Earth, which is the body. And so therefore there's this corresponding solution, supposedly, which is get away from it, get away from the Earth. Space will be better. Certainly more of it. You could say that, but it's not there to sustain us. There's no indication that space out there can sustain us the way that Earth is, you could say, designed to sustain us. But we were created by the Earth to some degree, physically anyway. So then we're an extension of it. So it's just our natural womb, if you will. It's our larger womb. And so I think that's a microcosm, or no, that's a macrocosm of something that's microcosmic too, which is that we're trying to project our consciousness into these seemingly infinite realms of the imagination, really, sort of cosmic anyway, maybe divine, maybe it's a surrogate for the divine, but we're doing it by going away from the body. And so our consciousness is becoming less and less settled in the body. And so my orientation, what I try to suggest in these books, even though it's implicitly, I'm not actually writing about it directly, is can we reorientate ourselves 180 degrees away from the mind and outer space, and back towards Earth, nature, and our bodies, and discover that we have never fully colonized our bodies, that our consciousness has never fully landed in our bodies. So we don't even know what that would be like. And if we were to start discovering what that would be like, would we discover that our bodies are that our life force itself is intelligent, as long as it's fully anchored in the physical, and that intelligence life force will guide us through absolutely anything, even as you said, a drunk driver on the road. We would know how to avoid the drunk driver, because this isn't about skillful being a good driver. It's about being so tuned into our life force that it alerts us to what's going on in our environment, all of the time.
Well, we're encouraged to, or we should say we're discouraged from listening to intuition or anything that might be called gut feeling, despite the fact, I don't know about you, but in my case, time and time again, it's shown to be a true guide to, feelings about something that come from I know not where, turned out to have validity. But we're told that there isn't really such a thing anyway, and you certainly can't, you must trust experts and technocrats, and they've not how you feel about something, that's invalid, that's your emotions, what's that got to do, what can that tell you? What you were just saying about there's something guiding us if we'll let it. There's a very interesting thread running throughout your book concerning psychic research and psychic abilities. And you speak about, I'm paraphrasing your words now, but you speak about domination of inner as well as outer space. And I think you used the phrase about life in space somehow perhaps activating psychic potential. So I don't know if you can comment on that, but I think that also this is relevant to your comment about our consciousness has never really fully landed in our bodies. I think if we survive long enough physically, we're just at the beginning of that process and understanding what that might look like. I agree with you. I don't think we've even scratched the surface.
Yeah. Well, I think we get sabotaged very early on. So babies, I can imagine that a baby isn't fully in its body in a natural way, because when it's in the womb, well, it doesn't have a sense of a body as separate from its mother's body. So its consciousness would be merged with its mother's consciousness, I think, very literally, viscerally speaking. And I think that continues after birth. As babies, we're partly in our bodies and partly in our mother's bodies, you could say. We're still, merged with our mother. And so there's a process of individuation, to use a Jungian word, but anyway, where our consciousness is supposed to start, to fully land in the body, or become fully embedded in the body. And babies, if you see how babies are, they are very physical. Like when they grab your hand or when they do something, they're really there. They put all the life force they have access to behind it. So, but I think that's probably the most embodied most of us ever get to be, because I think that period where we're actually beginning to become aware of ourselves as individuals and have a sense of us as consciousness possibly being like fully anchored in the physical, involves separating from the mother and having a sense of ourselves as individuals, and then perhaps connecting to the earth as the larger mother. Perhaps there's even that. We're interacting with our environment. Hopefully the Father's helping us to do that, and so on. But anyway, it's obviously a very long preamble. But what I look at with Prison Infinity that you were referring to there was with the Psychism was well, first of all, the Psychism, I think, is generally experienced and as advocated and exploited by some of these groups, and many books that we might read, and certainly, programs like the CIA and remote viewing and things like that. It does involve traumatizing the body. And so I think it involves sort of inserting a wedge in the psyche, preferably at a very early age, but it can be done later, that prevents or keeps us out of the body and keeps us somehow exposed to these psychic realms in a way that we're not using the body as just a natural instrument. We're actually using our disembodiment or exploiting it as a way to access psychic realms. So then the experiences of the psychic impressions aren't coming to us through our body, which is the natural way, which would be instinctive and intuitive. They're coming to us as a result of our being, split off from our body. So that's the thing I explore in Prisoner of Infinity. And then the thing about space, well, this is Edgar Mitchell, this claim of the overview effect, that going into space, i.e. uncoupling the human body from its second matrix, as I've used that term in a different meaning, but I mean its second womb of the earth, supposedly that has this profound effect on the human psyche that's similar to enlightenment, so that's not quite to say that it facilitates psychic powers, but I think that Edgar Mitchell probably claimed that as well. And who knows about that? I mean, who knows if there's any truth in that? Have human beings ever really left the planet? We don't really know for sure. We certainly don't know if they've gone all the way to the moon for sure. But let's just say, benefit of the doubt, that human beings have been able to get far enough from the planet to look back on the planet. Has this had a very profound effect on the psyche? And if so, why? There's a recent movie about this, actually, that I started watching with Natalie Portman, but I gave up on because I could see it was just this cheesy propaganda. But, and So why? Well, the common thing is because it's transcendent, and we start to appreciate the fragility of the planet and all these things. Well, maybe, but maybe that's also a kind of trauma. Maybe we're not supposed to physically separate from the Earth in that way. I'm not saying that there aren't higher dimensions and so on, but in this way, using technology, even violence, like rocket ships and so on, it's all the same system that many people believe is destroying the planet. And whether you believe that or not, you can certainly see that it's somehow anti-life. There's something about our system and our technology and our weapons and all that which really seem antithetical to the life force and to love and harmony. So why would we think that somehow we could use those weapons of mass destruction or those tools of space colonization to attain enlightenment? It doesn't add up to me. So then I'm more inclined to suspect that we're reenacting an original split that was traumatic, that was violent, the split from our mother, and our inability to really land in our bodies. Well, we'd never really landed on the planet either. So then leaving it as somehow that's supposed to enlighten us or provide the solution. I think we're just compulsively reenacting the trauma, thinking that we're going to solve it. Now, potentially it could solve it because we could see why we're doing it. Like every delusion does have a silver lining, because if we start to see through it and let the crucial fiction come undone, we'll understand. I suppose maybe I put that the wrong way. If we start to see it and understand it, like why we had to assemble this crucial fiction, it will start to come undone. So, and then we will reaccess the life force. So, I don't know if that's a very good argument actually for the positivity of it, but at least for the function of looking at it, like it's worth looking at these things, and there is something in us. I guess I'll just end on that. There is something in us that yearns for transcendence that isn't pathological or delusional. I think that's inescapable. We yearn for a God. We yearn for eternity. That's not a self-destructive impulse. That can be a very positive impulse. But when we externalize it and literalize it and turn it into, aliens from other dimensions or colonizing other planets, that's when I think it becomes actually something that takes us further from connecting to God, because we have to start with ourselves, with what we are. Like if we're not connected within ourselves to our own bodies, how can we possibly think we could connect to anything else?
Yeah, we do seem to be locked into sort of a cycle of denial and distraction, that there is anything transcendent that we might crave, that might be very necessary for us to pursue, and then chasing down these blind alleys, some of which we've been describing. It's interesting that as far as our own bodies go, quite early on in life, usually when we're teenagers, we quite often we become very aware of the body, puberty, for obvious reasons, things are changing. And that often involves a lot of, not too strong a word, disgust. And, whether it's things that are not talked about or things that we struggle to process. And this is all, of course, tied up with our feelings as well, our emotions. And for most people, that never really goes away. Does there anybody, you or I, or anybody listening to this, that say, I'm happy with my body in purely physical terms? What does that even mean? How important is it to be a certain way? We spend so much time chasing physical augmentation. I'm not talking about transhumanist variety now, but just, making ourselves better with, or quote unquote, with surgery or pills or constant diet and exercise, or just spending a lot of time quietly just loathing our physical appearance. Not saying everyone's like that, but a large proportion of people are one of the two, or moving between both.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's endemic. And as you say, becomes fully conscious as teenagers. I think again, well, as you're saying, the solution isn't in the externals. Like the more we try to fix our bodies or whatever it is, driven by that self-disgust or that self-rejection, it's not going to work. It might not make it worse, but it might. I mean, look at Michael Jackson. That's obviously not the way to go. I'm sure he was racked by self-disgust by the end. So the alternative again seems to me to be tuning into the body and finding that the life force itself is very close to what we think of as love, that it's an intelligent energy and it's a loving energy, I would say. So there's something about the body that is the opposite of narcissism and yet is also self-love. It's a true kind of self-love. And so there's an overlap there between, like, I'm trying to work on my diet a bit. I'm doing Lent now, and so I've stopped eating things that begin with CH. That's chips, cheese, and chocolate. You know, those are things I really enjoy a lot. I get a lot of mental stimulation and physical too. They're like drugs. So I just, well, yeah, okay, so I'll be a good Christian and I'll do without them for Lent. And, but that's a specific example. But generally, I do try to be as diligent as I can be about eating what is good for my body. Dave Ashana has been talking about this recently, that if we want to really change things in our ancestral line and get more tuned into the life force, well, start by tuning in and eating things that that will give us energy, and then using that energy to do things that we will feel good about. I mean, things that are worth doing, things that we're here to do as a way of giving thanks to the food. That's a very organic, loving relationship with our environment, the food, and with our bodies. You know, our consciousness, our bodies, and our environment as that sort of trinity there, isn't there? They're all overlapping. You are what you eat. The earth provides the food provides our bodies with energy, and then, you know, we ourselves, our consciousness, uses our bodies, or lets the earth use them. I mean, who knows where this guidance comes from? I think it transcends the earth, and it comes from the sun and beyond. I mean, these are real possibilities that are rejected by science or just ignored by science. They'd be considered mysticism or New Age, you know, woo, what have you. But they're experiential, and they are ways to regulate one's, you know, bodily activities that aren't vanity, that aren't narcissism, that do augment our sense of being at home in our bodies and our sense of self-acceptance. And I do think that there are individuals who are fully in their bodies and fully living their lives and aren't conflicted in this way. I mean, I know I've made significant steps over the years. A lot of it has to do with working with Dave Ashana, who I've told you about, might be a good guest for your podcast. And a lot of that has to do with actually hanging around with somebody who seems completely at home in their bodies and seems to love their lives and just love living their lives. That's so unusual to be around that and to see that it's possible. It kind of emboldens one. And so I've noticed changes over it's actually 12 years since I met him, but certainly over the last few years, I've really noticed changes that lead me to believe even that there's an end point. You know, it's possible to be fully here, fully landed, and fully at home in our bodies, and to let the life force guide us, to let life live us and take our hands off the wheel. And then, I mean, everything changes then. That would be a real singularity, as in an omega point where everything changed for you, the individual. Perhaps the illusion of being an individual would change too, and then we'd realize that, oh my God, you know, all these other humans who are still locked in this trauma hell realm, until they get free, you know, I'll never be free either. But still, at least one had taken the step, you know, had crossed the threshold, and so could then come back and help others to see that threshold. So still, there would be a fundamental change, and I think that change is not only possible, but it's absolutely essential for us to survive. It's like, as I say, the real singularity as compared to the counterfeit. And I also think that it's actually very close, not in terms of likelihood, but I mean, for us as individuals to simply reorient ourselves to our bodies and start listening to our bodies and then let the life force lead us. I mean, that could happen in a moment. It seems to me that our resistance to that could be largely like a paper tiger that we've been terrified by. That if we were just to look at it long enough, we'd see that actually what comes between us and peace, love, and harmony is nothing at all.
Yeah, well, we filled the world and our lives and our bodies and our minds with so much plastic garbage and noise. You know, it seems to like fill every fibre and every pore in every second, you know, so that there's no room for anything else, any other signals to get through. But the space colonization schemes are, on one level, for the advocates about the human race not dying. You know, as a collective whole, we will go on, no matter what happens to life on Earth. And the transhumanist agenda is again about the individual or the mind not dying. But all this life extension, immortality, delusions, mind uploading, and all the rest of it, I can't imagine what life would be like if it just wasn't going to end, unless, you know, violently and deliberately, or accidentally, I suppose. And I've talked to one of these life extension advocates, you know, 500 years to 1,000 years. No reason why we can't do this with technology going forward, tweaking genes and DNA and all the rest of it. But in many ways, for good things are only really good when we kind of know, even if it's subconsciously, that they will end. You know, like going on a holiday or a day out or going to a party or a wedding or something. It's like, this isn't just reality forever. We know that these things will eventually come to an end. But of course, with our inbuilt, not quite species-wide, but almost species-wide terror of death, you know, as the last taboo, it just informs so much about how we live or otherwise on the earth. And I think that whole idea about, I think it's very interesting to think about that in the context of what you've been talking about landing fully in the body. It's like this, as far as we can tell, we don't really understand fully what it's for, but it itself is transitory. Maybe there's something before and after that. Again, we only have anecdotal evidence for that, but I feel anyway that there's something really important about this experience, that it isn't completely random. So there's something, as you say, we might be very close to it, but there's something we're not quite grasping about this experience that we're having.
Well, death, of course, we're very close to it. I mean, in various ways, we're close to it in the sense that we could die at any time. We absolutely don't know. We're also close to it in terms of 80 years really is just a heartbeat in cosmic time. And you know, when we're on our deathbeds, if we actually get to be in bed, as opposed to with our boots, I think I'd rather have my boots on. But anyway, when we see death coming, if we get to see it coming, we're going to think, my God, it was just a moment. Yeah. So, and that's going to be our final moment. So that will be the defining moment in some way. So yeah, death is something that is very close. And I think that actually, I said this years ago, that death in a way is synonymous for God or vice versa. I mean, they both represent the ultimate unknown. Now, of course, for the atheist, death is just synonymous for death, you know, for non-existence. That was my brother's position. But I'm not really interested in positions or philosophies. I'm interested in reality. And although I'm not going to claim to know what reality is in my mind, I'm pretty sure the body knows what it is. I'm also pretty sure the body isn't afraid of death unless it has a reason to be, as in its fear or its adrenaline will help it to survive. I think that fear of death, as you're talking about, and what makes death a taboo is a mental thing. It's a mental lack of a relationship, isn't it? It's a refusal to have a relationship with a reality we call death, which I would say is symptomatic of a refusal to have reality with our bodies. And I think a lot of people think maybe, if they think about this at all, though, we don't want to really be in our bodies because death is so frightening, or so if we're not in our bodies, we somehow will escape death. I think there's some truth in that, but it's also a bit circular. Because we've never really got into our bodies, we've never really been able to think about death in a way that's embodied, that's healthy. And so we've got this phantasm, it's like Satan really, that we call death, that, and I'm not exempt by any means. When I think about death, which I do all the time, in a way, I mean, I don't sit around thinking about it. I mean, it comes into my awareness a lot, several times a day, and there is a fear response. It's like, oh shit, I am going to die someday. But on the other hand, as you're saying, there's also something beside the fear, which is, I'm going to die someday. As you say, life becomes more meaningful then. Of course it does, because I'm going to die someday. I don't just have endless minutes and hours to piss away doing crap that isn't worth doing, or being afraid of doing or saying things that need to be done and said. It's ridiculous, right? We're in this bizarre contradictory thing where our awareness of death, instead of encouraging us to live, inspiring us to live fully, which is what it's truly for, I think, it shuts us down. We kind of make this, it's not rational, but one could sort of pretend it's rational and say, in a way to understand it, to say, we make this, we reason that if I don't fully live, I won't fully die. As in, if I don't fully love the souls that I connect with, if I don't fully enjoy my life here, it will be less painful when I die. Now, so that's not a rational thing, but you can see how there's something in us that had some formative or series of formative experiences where life was too painful, so we chose not to live it fully. And it's almost like death is again a paper tiger that's a stand-in for that, for our fear of life. We're so afraid of life that we don't live. And so because we don't live, death becomes terrifying. Because imagine dying, and this is something we can all imagine dying, it's actually a cliche, and realizing that we never lived. All the things we didn't say and do. Death would be terrifying. I mean, it would be so heartbreaking. It would be terrifying. And there may very well be metaphysical dimensions that we intuit there, which is that what we die unfinished, we die into, our regret. We die into our regret, and we pass it on to our children. And then we're in some disembodied realm, not in the AI cloud, but in the Akashic realms or whatever, the Bardo, who knows, where consciousness goes after the body dies, helpless witnesses to, the mess that we didn't clean up, or our descendants that are carrying our burdens. So I think there is a very real dimension to hell, this idea of hell, not just that we're recreating it on Earth, but there's some hell of the disembodied realm, and that although it probably doesn't help to fear that, I think it's right to acknowledge it, that, death does come to us all, and death is a day of judgment for us all, and we will be judged, whether we say by God or by our own souls, our own unconscious. When it's revealed to us, it's 6 to 1, half a dozen to another. It's going to feel like the wrath of God or the mercy of God, or both, when that time comes. So why not get right with God here and now? And why not align with our bodies? Well, absolutely, yeah, why not? The answer is that we're afraid to, and so we create all of these distractions. And as you say, we've got the phony transcendental. We can pretend that the real transcendental doesn't exist, even while we're filling that vacuum with phony imitations of it that keep us distracted from our death, and finally perpetuate the narrative, the crucial fiction that we're going to live forever.
Well, as someone once said, one day we will die, but on all other days we will not. That's something I like to say to myself. Well, as we begin to move things to a conclusion for today, I've often wondered if physical evolution for human beings hasn't come to an end, and maybe it'll be self-driven from now on. Perhaps we're on the cusp of a new evolutionary stage that might be mental or psychic, or in terms of deeper awareness. Or I don't really know. Those are which words that I've used in the past. That we're a journey within. If we feel that physical frontiers may be on some level exhausted, certainly they are in materialistic terms. So that would be evolving, or transcending the body and the planet, I suppose, in a different sense. That evolving the psyche, the mind.
At first, I was feeling that you were being perhaps too optimistic as far as foreseeing any future for humanity at all. I don't see much beyond the next few years, but I've always felt that way, so it may just be something in me, in my psyche, some sort of imprint. I think what I've been looking at recently and blogging about, somewhat under the influence of Dave Oshana, but it's not only that. It's definitely congruent with my own intuitions and instincts over the years, but it's always been changing. This feeling that humanity is collectively destroying itself, and what that's going to look like and how that pertains to evolution or the lack thereof. To me, it has to do, if there's any hope for us at all, which is what evolution is. It's a scientific version of hope, isn't it? Or God, or what have you. It's the higher guiding principle. And I certainly believe there's a higher guiding principle that's in our bodies. So that would be somewhat consistent with the idea of evolution. But I think evolution's been very co-opted as a language or as a term, and it gets sort of mixed up with this idea of progress. So I'm a bit suspicious of it. But let's say as a development, as a possible way through this huis clos, this dead end we seem to be in, as a species, what I sense and intuit, and I'm very reluctant about it because it's really not very appealing, is that the only way that we can possibly get through this eye of the needle is by well, the analogy there is the rich man doesn't enter, so I guess I'd say first by dropping all of our baggage. We've got to let go of an awful lot to survive, I think, as individuals and collectively, an awful lot. You were saying that before about all of this plastic, and it's just in our cells and everything. So we need a massive purge. But how that's going to happen is something else. But the other thing I was going to say that's related is that seems to me that, and perhaps this is a more specific or concrete way of describing possibly what you're describing as in going inward and opening ourselves up psychically as well as with our senses, that it may be that we are all interconnected as individuals in such a deep, implicate way, such an essential way, that we essentially don't exist as individuals at all. We only exist as a collective body of humanity that's distributed throughout 8 billion bodies that are seemingly hell-bent on destroying themselves, albeit with this psychopathic elite at the top. But the psychopathic elite would only represent in this model like the superego of the organism, of the meta-organism of humanity. So although, you could say that there's a small fraction that are driving us into destruction, we're still part of that, unless we allow for non-human element, which is a whole subject unto itself. So my sense is that really becoming aware of who we are and tuning into our bodies and finding a genuine solution that isn't the things we've been talking about today, the pseudo-techno-dystopian solutions, the techno-narcissistic solutions, entails merging with each other, with letting ourselves see that we are interconnected and opening ourselves up to each other as seemingly discrete souls, and allowing the life force to go where it has to go, being guided by that, and bringing us together in ways that are unprecedented and terrifying and extremely undesirable, really. So, can we learn to live together? It's the short version, right? And that would have to start on a micro scale. So I wouldn't even dare to talk about this if I didn't have my experience in the thrift store over the past 4 years, which I've had to do that. I've had to be constantly opening my doors, literally, to some quite undesirable customers, and be there saying, can I help you? What do you need? Giving them stuff, letting them steal, letting them come in drunk and on drugs, and really, stuff that if I could choose, I would avoid all of those interactions, but I can't. And I think we can't, as human beings, we can't really avoid the fact that if humanity is destroying itself, then we're all going to go down, and we can't really save ourselves except by saving each other. However that would come about. I mean, I'm not suggesting any kind of Mother Teresa drive, but I think it begins with some kind of really deep felt recognition of our shared humanity, and that, of course, prevents us from pointing the finger and saying, well, all those other humans fucked everything up for me, right? It's really like we've all been complicit. So we're all doing in our little ways, we may all be contributing to the self-destruction drive. And it's easy to point the finger at the other and say, well, look, that person's worse than I am and they're doing it worse than me. But that would seem to perpetuate the scapegoating, isn't it? That perpetuates the complicity, essentially, because really we look at ourselves and say, well, I am actually doing some shitty stuff to my body and therefore to the planet and other human beings. So when I see other people being shitty, rather than judge them, can I help them in some way?
A useful way to think about it sometimes is to think about the cells in your brain. Individual brain cells are not at war with each other. They're not stealing from each other. They're not condemning each other. In the wider body, your liver is not taking resources from your kidneys because there are limited resources. It's all a symbiotic system that's completely interdependent. So it's...
Thank you for that. I mean, we brought it back to, because this is a practical thing, and the danger is it can end up seeming sentimental, and it's absolutely not. It's wholly practical. It's how a body functions optimally. And interestingly, that's the analogy that David Shan has been using, so you probably could have an interesting conversation with him about this. Although when he talks about neurons, he doesn't keep it to the brain, which I think is important here. So we're talking about the system. And of course, the intestinal tract has neurons and the heart has neurons too. So really the whole body is a neurological system. And there are many ways, there are countless ways, let me count the ways, in which those neurons and those systems are not functioning optimally and not communicating optimally, starting with this fear, fear contraction of trauma that's in our cells that then makes our bodies, the body armor and Reich system, all tightened up and rigid, which then prevents us from moving fluidly in life, which prevents us from relating and connecting to others, which creates, a whole species that's at war with itself, which creates the society and the civilization, which constantly re-traumatizes us and basically farms the newborn babies into the pods to keep the machine world running. That's the whole thing right there, isn't it?
Well, in terms of a way forward, a path out of this, or meaning and purpose, I can see in part where transhumanist urges and the mania for getting off world are stemming from in one way, and it's not just all the topics that we've talked about, but it's a feeling that as a species, we're supposed to be moving. We're supposed to be doing something. And I don't know if that's completely invalid or not. The rest of life on the planet doesn't seem to have that sort of drive. It seems content to just be. Look at some of the species that have been on Earth for millions of years, completely unchanged almost, since the time of the dinosaurs, even earlier. If we did achieve some kind of balance within ourselves, within the species on the planet, there still would be people asking the question, yeah, but what are we going to do? Are we just going to, to eat and drink and have our societal interactions and make the things that we need for day-to-day life and maybe have some culture, reading and writing and music? But what are we going to do? There's this feeling, and tell me if you think it's completely misplaced, that there's some kind of teleology, some kind of drive that maybe we don't even understand. Maybe that's what we're struggling with at the minute, trying to figure out what it is. But I have this inherent feeling that we're supposed to be doing something, and that might sound inarticulate, but I don't quite know how else to say it.
So by doing, you mean accomplishing something, don't you?
Or that doesn't have to be physical, but it's what I mentioned earlier when I was talking about evolution, just that there's kind of an ongoing thing.
The purpose that transcends the everyday.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, in that respect to evolution, isn't it? Is there an evolutionary function of humanity besides creating more of itself? I mean, because those species that you talked about, you said they haven't changed over millions of years, so it seems like they don't have a particular function beyond contributing to the system at large, which is not a small thing, of course, if we eat them or if they, however they help nurture and nourish the ecosystem at large. There does seem to be something about human beings whereby we have some purpose or mission or function that does transcend nature itself, as in we're not just here replicating so the whole thing can keep going, because it's going to end eventually. Life on Earth will end, before or after the humans, or whatever, whether the humans die out first, life on Earth will end. So, but I think that's interesting because as a question, because initially I thought, well, why on earth would people want more than just living and eating and drinking and being merry together? What could possibly be more to life than that if we really were happy and fulfilled? And of course, that's true by definition. It's tautological. If we're fulfilled, we're fulfilled. But I would agree, actually, that we're only going to be fully satisfied with merely living if we have connected to our deep life purpose. But I don't think we need to understand it mentally. I think we might get intimations of that, and I could even suggest what some of those things might be to you, as in, my opinion, but I don't think it would have much value, because I think we'd then be quite close, ironically, to the transhumanists and the Whitley Strieber's, very close to the Whitley Strieber's, actually. So I don't know about, I was going to say to religious people, but I suppose they generally just say the purpose of life is to get into heaven. So that's not so similar to what I imagine or perceive, which is, well, perhaps it is similar in a certain sense, but.
Well, maybe that's just metaphorical. Maybe that's one of the things that, mystery traditions and religions have handed down across the ages are symbolic systems and meanings that we just boil down into very crude things like, getting into heaven to talk to the, God sitting on a cloud, etc.
Yeah, but I think the difference that I was stumbling over was that getting into heaven involves leaving Earth, and it's not during this life, so it's some sort of reward, as opposed to, and the transhumanist thing and the space colonization is about in this life. And I do feel in that particular case more aligned with those distortions than with the Christian distortion, which is it's all just in the afterlife. I feel as though our function, our purpose as human beings is there in the gospel, that it is to fully incarnate, fully embody the divine principle on earth, which would make heaven and earth synonymous. But I don't think that is going to be, I think it will be the fruit of our labor, but I don't think it will be the result of our actions. If that, I just split a big hair there, didn't I? But I mean, I was trying to make a distinction between, I think if we do what we came here to do, which is just, get fully embodied and then let the life force live our lives, then the fruit of that will be heaven on earth, as opposed to if we think, I'm going to draw the maps and the plans now for heaven on earth and then I'll be happy. That's transhumanism. So that's a really key difference. I think all we have to do is show up. We just have to land and start living our lives, and heaven will start emerging into this realm, or God, or whatever we're going to call that. Fully, the life force will start distributing, and we will be as the birds and the bees, and that, of course, would be heaven on earth, if we could even imagine that. And then, who knows? I mean, maybe then Earth joins, some intergalactic community, and we go to the next level. Sure, maybe that's part of it. Because if we're in the time stream, presumably there's some divine plan unfolding. I mean, presumably, tautologically, by definition, if there's God in time, then God's got a plan. He's not just sitting there watching and, kind of enjoying the show, because God is immanent as well as transcendent. So something's unfolding, and we seem to be the primary instrument of it. And weirdly, our self-destruction is part of that. Even if it happens, that's presumably God collects the information and says, okay, next time, how do we avoid that? We put all that data into the galactic computer. Now I'm using transhumanist terminology, and so the next iteration will get it right.
Well, there's even a alternate reading of the Bible, of the Old Testament, as I read a book based on this, and it was an interesting way of looking at the scripture, of saying that there was creation version 1 on Earth, which was then the Petri dish was kind of like, oh, this has all gone wrong. So the scientist throws away the contents of the Petri dish and starts again, basically, so that the creation, the let there be light, was actually number 2, and there was something before that. But if we don't make it on this physical realm, and it's possible that is the only one that there is, then maybe we'll never know if anything reboots or restarts further down the line. Maybe this will have been it. Now, and that leads me on to kind of a final talking point. In one of our previous chats, I speculated, or said it was at least valid to consider the proposition that beyond Earth, that there is nothing out there, that is to say, no life. Now, we've no idea where the universe extends to, how much of it there is. As far as our instruments can reach, there's a hell of a lot of it, mind-boggling numbers. And I say, you were a bit surprised. You really, you think there could be nothing whatsoever out there. And I say, well, there's just no evidence for it at the minute. It doesn't mean that there isn't, but it's a perfectly valid question to ponder, theoretical question. Now, in your book, towards the end, you do use the phrase space is a whole lot of nothing. And this is in the context of you asking why, with regards to transhumanism, space colonization. And again, I'm paraphrasing, are these people really so concerned with their descendants that they are going to embark on an endeavour of this sort of scale and complexity?
Well, I suppose we're back to transcending death, aren't we? So if you can't transcend death by becoming immortal, then you have, you put your life force, your imagination into your kids, your descendants, your progeny, and they can live on. And so it'd be very essential then that the human race continues to live on. Because if the human race dies, then there isn't even that kind of immortality. So, the fear of death would seem to be, at least from one aspect, and we're talking particularly in a secular age or an atheistic age in which God, quote unquote, is dead. For many people, or certainly the ruling elite, it seems, they killed him. Then death signifies non-existence, which, ironically, my father used to say to me, well, because he believed death was non-existent, he believed in nothing. So I said, aren't you afraid? And he said, well, why are you afraid? I won't be there when it happens. And I found that crazy. But actually now in my 50s, I could see there's a certain something in that. Actually, non-existence from one point of view is the most terrifying thing there is. From another, it's nothing. It's literally nothing. But again, individuals who are unable to live and unable to really tune into a consciousness that transcends their minds, I think that is probably the greatest terror that there is. And so they will there's this terror management theory of what's his name, Solomon Sheldrake, I think. I had him on the limb list a long time ago. It's from Ernest Becker, the denial of death, that the whole of culture is fueled by fear of death. And it works precisely because it keeps us busy, so we don't have to think about it, by giving us pursuits that are sufficiently meaningful that they, occupy our awareness completely enough that death doesn't sneak through any of those cracks. So I think that space, and there is a kind of poetic representation of this, isn't there? And that space is a whole lot of nothing, and yet we can, precisely because of that, we can project everything onto it. We can fill it with whatever we want, even God. Our memory of God. Space is literally big enough to fill, because it's literally infinite. I mean, it is infinite to the human mind. We can't imagine the end. How do you imagine the end of space? What's on the other side, right? It's infinite. So yeah, it receives our projections. And so you've got a combination of things there. You've got the truly innate longing for union with infinity, with eternity, with God, which must be built into every organism in some way. Like, we come from that, we're going to return to it. We come from the eternal, we're going to return to it. So there is an innate longing, but then there's also the terror of death, which is a social, symptom, a symptom of over-socialization and trauma. And then that gets spliced to the innate longing, which fuels it and generates, I would say, what you're asking about there is the ultimate displacement activity, i.e. what can we do that will really keep us so busy and that it will provide sufficient counterfeit, surrogate meaning that we don't notice that it's meaningless. Well, there you have it. The only way the human race can survive and my own descendants can live on for eternity, in quotes, for a pseudo-eternity, is by going off into space and becoming, making my descendants the avant-garde of the colonizers of the infinite. I mean, that's a great story. That's Star Trek, isn't it? The prime directive. It's for kids, in my view, because it's such a simplification of something. As you say, we don't even know if there's anything out there. What if the only thing out there are lesser species? Because if they were higher, wouldn't they have come to visit us? And if they haven't, why not? So maybe the only thing out there is much less evolved species, and we would be like in Star Trek, we would have to be the midwives of them, helping them. Well, who could be deluded enough to think that the humanity as is could possibly serve the function of a benevolent, colonizing species that would help other species evolve? You would have to be so insane to believe that. But as you say, there is half of this equation is total insanity, which brings me to actually one thing I wanted to say today as well. The other thing, which is, those the gods wish to destroy, they first make mad. And my sense is that this is a story that humanity is telling itself so that it can commit suicide without realizing that it's doing it, and even believing that it's doing something wonderful and noble and good.
Well, perhaps that's a good point to end on, because we can get as far as what else may be out there and reasons why we haven't discovered it yet. That's a whole other conversation in itself.
Yeah, not a very happy note to end on, but it's certainly an end note.
Well, I just think it's a bit like, for me, contemplating black void of nothingness out there is a little bit like contemplating death, really. Kind of, if it is, then it is what it is. If as like the school of idealism, which I'm kind of increasingly warming to as my life goes on, if in fact everything is within mind, then it's possible that we are it here on this like sort of little green blob on a pale blue dot. and that everything we see out there with our telescopes and other fancy gear is just debris from that original creative thought, as it were. It's just the sort of the stuff left over, the offcuts, as it were.
Yeah, well, I mean, compared to the infinite, or compared to God, it's true that one planet is no smaller than a multiverse, is it? Like it's all nothing in relation to the enormity of God. I mean, the unimaginable infinitude of God. And I certainly don't disagree that we, so far as we exist at all, we can only exist in eternity as some articulation of God or the eternal. So yeah, in that sense, that we are all there is. Even if there are other species out there, they would also be within us. My Father's house has many mansions, so why not look within for making contact?
Today, Jason, our talk has been inspired by your book, Prisoner of Infinity, UFOs, Social Engineering and the Psychology of Fragmentation. That's easily available, all the usual outlets, as are your other books. But before we sign off, just share details of your website. And you mentioned The Liminalist a little while ago. That's your own podcast series which you run. So just put any of that out there you'd like to.
Yeah, I'll have to get you on The Liminalist one of these days.
Okay, I don't know what we're going to talk about, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. We'll just continue these many unfinished conversations. Yeah, so it's auticulture.com. That's AUTI, culture from autism. The Liminalist podcast between is there, as well as my ongoing blog posts and links to my various books. Yeah, I always like to hear from people, so there's a contact thing there as well. Always looking to interact with other souls out there. This isn't a passive enterprise I'm involved in, so I'm always happy to get feedback from people.
Splendid. Well, once again, Jason, thanks so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Thank you, Greg.